Hi, everybody. This is Ann Patchett at Parnassus Books. Thank you for listening to Parnassus Presents. Your support allows us to keep bringing you fantastic events. So please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book at the link below. We hope you enjoy the event, recorded live from the Parnassus stage.
So this is a great crowd, and this is such a great author and a fabulous book. I'm Elise Adler. I'm the director of events here at Parnassus Books, so I get to say thank you for being here. First of all, welcome to Parnassus. I know a lot of familiar faces here, and if anybody is here for the first time, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. And thank you for shopping local. Thank you for supporting Parnassus Books. And it's because you do that we can have these amazing authors as we have tonight. And you make that possible, so thank you. I usually bring my phone, which apparently I've lost, but I bring my phone out here, and so I hope it's not ringing in the back. But if you would turn your phones off, that would be wonderful. The books that you have purchased, I imagine, are signed, and if they aren't, or even if they are, if you would like to be on the signing line at the end of the event, Colm will go ahead and sign and personalize your books for you. And we're going to have you line up in the most civilized of ways, and the line will be wonderful, and everybody will be happy. So just very briefly, I could, talk all night about Colm Tóibín, because he's just that amazing. And now that I've met him, I don't know, he's like through the roof and to the stars and back. So he is New York Times best-selling. He is an award-winning author. He's written, I think, 11 novels, 2 books, 2 collections of short stories. He's written any number of nonfiction books. And tonight he is here to celebrate our first edition selection, Long Island. So just help me welcome Colm Tóibín.
Thank you for coming. Is this working? Can you hear me at the back? I just wanted to start by defining literature. What is literature? Literature, Ezra Pound said, is news that stays news. But it doesn't seem to me to be true, because news at the moment seems to stay news. And literature seems to be strange. That there are people here who are my age will remember a time when there were, for example, if it had been 50 years ago and we were here, we would be talking about Solzhenitsyn, the Russian writer. And we're talking about a day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, or the Gulag Archipelago, and these were the books from 50 years ago that everybody was talking about. He just won the Nobel Prize. Or a decade later, we could be arguing the virtues of, say, John Updike and John Cheever versus William Gaddis and William Gass. And these were the sort of arguments people had, and every decade they seemed to change. But I was wondering if there was, the way people always say, where I'm from, do Americans agree on anything? Is there anything they all agree on? And I say, yeah, that there was a moment in the 1980s, I think, when a lot of Americans thought that there was nothing bad you could ever say about a man called William Maxwell. And William Maxwell he wrote novellas, perhaps rather than novels. They were delicate, they were melancholy, they often had endings that sort of just seemed to appear from nowhere, almost like rain, in Irish summer. And he didn't use plot, he built character, but more than character, he built atmosphere. He was very good at disappointment. And so that it was a funny moment, perhaps, in America, where that sort of writing, which was more gentle, more melancholy, more, I suppose, more in a minor key, more like chamber music than like rock music. And he was fiction editor of the New Yorker magazine, and so he introduced and I suppose fostered a group of writers who would have included John Updike, John Cheever, Alice Munro, I suppose, and anyway, many other writers of those short stories that seem to deal with the possibility of happiness. And then, no, there wouldn't be happiness. But there wouldn't quite be, in other words, there would never be tragedy, there would be sadness. There would never be triumph. There would be some moment, some glowing moment of hope. And he wrote his own books, books like So Long, See You Tomorrow, and They Came Like Swallows, and they were really everyone admired them for their delicacy. I think it was a time when people wanted delicacy. I don't think people need delicacy so much now. But then they did. And William Maxwell, he was a sort of almost a cult figure among writers, that he knew how to create a moment in which a story would turn. And you could never tell exactly what the moment was because it was buried in the rhythm. So I thought this matter was settled. I thought we had come, to an agreement that even though it was historically the case that William Maxwell was, that no one ever knew how to say anything bad about him. Well, imagine my surprise when a colleague of mine who teaches at Columbia University, his office is 2 doors down from mine, Edward Mendelsohn, he wrote this book, which is called Moral Agents, 8 20th Century American Writers. And there's an essay on William Maxwell, and I will just read you this paragraph of it, and you can imagine my surprise, having all the things I've said about Maxwell, that this now would be what someone could say about him. This is not me, him. This is Edward Mendelsohn. All of Maxwell's novels have a story, but no plot. A plot. And you can see the professor talking, suddenly students look, a plot. What's a plot? And he goes, a plot is the means by which fiction portrays the consequences of actions. So that it isn't actions. A plot is not an action. A plot is the consequences of an action. But it is not like a pool table. One event never mechanically causes another. In a plot, each event provokes other events by making it possible for them to happen. Possible but not inevitable, because human beings are always free to choose their response to provocation. William Maxwell, succumbed to an error. I like the word error here. An error. It sounds like a sort of religious thing that he was in error. And anyway, he succumbed to an error common among writers who organize their work for the finest possible rhythms and textures. The error of thinking of plot as mechanical and therefore trivial. As he explained to John Updike, this is what William Maxwell explained to John Updike, plot, schmott. So I read this a few times. I sat up because I thought that I was one of the ones who was guilty of this business of succumbing to an error common among writers who organize their work for the finest possible rhythms and textures, the error of thinking a plot as mechanical and therefore trivial. So if we think about a quintessential moment when a writer who wants to create a plot has to begin by creating an action that can never stand on its own, that must have consequences. Not implications, but consequences, direct or indirect. We think about Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, and the opening of The Mayor of Casterbridge, which is that at a fair, at a sort of country fair where people are selling vegetables and the sort of circus things are going on in England, I suppose it's the 1860s or 70s, a man stands up on a podium and his wife is with him, and he says to the crowd, crowd is gathered, I am selling my wife, I am putting her up for auction. And everybody gathers because this is not something they've heard before. And the man seems deadly serious, and the wife is standing beside him. And over to the right, as in many Thomas Hardy novels, there's a man, another man. He's younger, he's mysterious, he's silent. Nobody knows who he is. He puts up his hand and says, I'll buy her. And that evening, that man from over there and the woman walk out of the town. Now, no matter what you do with this, there have to be consequences. Even if the novel has 200 pages without mentioning these people, somehow they're going to come back. You can't just do that in a book. And so that is, I suppose, an action that would automatically seem to demand consequences. So I wrote a novel called Brooklyn, and I didn't ever plan to write a sequel, and then I did. And I suppose it's a sign of weak will and just general bad character. But water. And so this is 25 years later. So Eilish is in her early 20s in Brooklyn. She's in her mid-40s here. And it's in Brooklyn, Tony, her husband, has promised that if she marries him, he will take her to Long Island, because that is where the migration, that's the direction people were going. In other words, it's the 1950s into the 1960s, and the family builds 4 houses, and one for the parents, Tony's parents, one for Tony and Eilish, and 2 for Tony, for Tony's two brothers and their families. And they're living there in this cul-de-sac in a place called Lindenhurst in Long Island. On Long Island. And the mother-in-law is called Francesca. Ailish is called Ailish. And her son is called Larry. Her daughter is called Rosella. And her husband is called Tony. That Irishman has been here again. I'll start again. That Irishman has been here again, her mother-in-law said, sitting down at the kitchen table. He's come to every house, but it's you he's looking for. I told him you would be home soon. What does he want? Ailish asked. I did everything to make him tell me, but he wouldn't. He asked for you by name. He knows my name. Francesca, her mother-in-law's smile had an insinuating edge. Ailish appreciated her mother-in-law's intelligence and also her sly sense of humour. And another man is the last thing I need, Ailish said. Who are you talking to? They both laughed as Francesca, the mother-in-law, stood up to go. From the window, Ailish watched her walk carefully across the damp grass to her own house. Soon Larry, their son, would be in from school, and then Rosella from after-school study, and then Ailish would hear Tony, her husband, parking his car outside. This would be a perfect time for a cigarette. But having found Larry smoking, she had made a bargain with him that she would give up completely. This is 1976, by the way, when you could still give up smoking. That she would give up completely if he promised not to smoke again. She still had a packet upstairs. When the doorbell rang, Ailish stood up lazily, presuming that it was one of Larry's cousins calling for him. However, from the hallway, she made out the silhouette of a grown man through the frosted glass of the door. Until he called out her name, it did not occur to her. This was the man her mother-in-law had mentioned. She opened the door. You are Ailish. The accent was Irish, with a trace, she thought, of Donegal, like a teacher she'd had in school. Also, the way the man stood there, as though waiting to be challenged, reminded her of home. I am, she said. I've been looking for you. His tone was almost aggressive. She wondered if Tony's business could owe him money. So I hear. You are the wife of the plumber? Since the question sounded rude, she saw no reason to reply. He's good at his job, your husband. I'd say he's in great demand. The man stopped for a second, looking behind him to check no one was listening. He fixed everything in our house, he went on, pointing a finger at her. He even did a bit more than was in the estimate. Indeed, he came back regularly when he knew that the woman of the house would be there and I would not. And his plumbing is so good that she used to have a baby in August. He stood back and smiled broadly at her expression of disbelief. That's right. That's why I'm here. And I can tell you for a fact that I am not the father. It had nothing to do with me. But I'm married to the woman who is having this baby, and if anyone thinks I am keeping an Italian plumber's brat in my house and have my own children believe that it came into the world as decently as they did, you can have another think. He pointed a finger at her again. So as soon as this little bastard is born, I am transporting it here. And if you're not at home, then I will hand it to that other woman. And if there's no one at all in any of the houses you people own, I'll leave it right here on your doorstep. He walked towards her and lowered his voice. And you can tell your husband from me that if I ever see his face anywhere, I'll come after him with an iron bar that I keep handy. Now, have I made myself clear? Ailish wanted to ask him what part of Ireland he was from as a way of ignoring what he had said, but he'd already turned away. She tried to think of something else that might engage him. Have I made myself clear? He asked again as he reached the car. When she did not reply, he made as though to approach the house once more. I'll be seeing you in August, or it could be late July, and that's the last time I'll see you, Ailish. How do you know my name? She asked. That husband of yours is a great talker. That's how I know your name. He told my wife all about you. So that's the opening 2.5 pages of the book. You can see, no. mean, you can see the problem that arises now. Because, I mean, not just for these people, but for how do you then proceed? Because if you go on like this for another few pages, you really lose the reader because it's just too much. There's too much shouting. There's just too much intense. And so you have to bring it down. But where can you bring it? And if I was writing a Brazilian soap opera, it'd be really easy because I could have her going over to her mother-in-law. They could have a major row over the whole thing, screaming at each other. Or they could bond and they could be ready to attack Tony when he came in the door. There's so many options, but none of them would work. So I have to bring it down, and at the same time, does she go upstairs? Does she go into the kitchen? She can't make tea. Irish, there's too much tea in Irish novels. No more tea. So she can't make tea. She can't. So I go through every possibility of what she might do. And she thinks of phoning her sister, but then in this sort of magical thinking moment, her sister is actually dead, and her mother is in Ireland, and she's in Long Island, so her mother doesn't even have a telephone. So, is there anyone she can call? Because she can't really make any sense of this, except that one of the reasons why I have made this man Irish, I mean, this is Long Island, he could be anything, is first of all, I have to get a sound for his voice that I cannot make a single mistake with. If I try and make him from the Bronx or something and try and put a Bronx tone into his voice, I will make one little error. And that little error will be enough to bring the whole thing down because you say no one from the Bronx has ever used that word. And so you have to be very careful because even though we speak the same language in certain ways, under certain pressures, we don't. And just need to say that this novel I wrote before this called Brooklyn, I did some research. I mean, I went, because Eilish has to go to one baseball game, I decided I should do that too, just go to one and slightly misunderstand how it worked and not be sure. But so I wrote all that, and I very confidently sent it, and the editor called me up and said, there's a problem with this baseball game of yours. I said, yeah, and she said, well, you don't. I said, no, I think, She said, well, it's that hot dog thing. And I said, hot dog? Yeah, there were hot dogs. I got hot dogs. Do you have another word? Do Americans have another word for hot dogs? And she said, no, but you have, if you wanted me to read it out to you, that at halftime they went and got hot dogs. And I said, what? They went and got hot dogs, that's what we did. And I said, no, there's no I said, there was halftime. And then when she told me it's called the seventh inning stretch, I realized that that's almost unsayable, at least in my accent, with my the seventh what? Anyway, but luckily the book was not printed at that time. And instead of making, I was saved from being the butt of immense laughter in the five boroughs. Like everywhere I would go, people would say, that's the halftime guy. So, you have to be very careful with this sort of idea of idiom. But the other reason is that she knows how to read this man. In other words, that's an Irishman who she just knows. He doesn't make things up. He doesn't make false accusations. He's come in all seriousness. She actually can read him in a way that she mightn't be able to were he, for example, from Manhattan or were he from somewhere else in America. She might just wonder, was he playing with her? Was it about something else? But this man, she knows. She can, as I say, read him. The only thing I can think of that she might do, and I went through many options. Funny, you go through an option at night and it seems great. And then in the morning, in the cold light of morning, it's just a disaster. Get it out. So the only thing I can think of her to do is she goes to the telephone. And I've never done this. I've never seen anyone do it. And she just simply lifts up the receiver. She doesn't dial a number. She just lifts up the receiver as though somehow that will be some way of reaching the outside world to sort of see if she could test what this man has just said to her. But that's as much as she does. She puts the receiver back down. And what she decides to do then is that after consultation with many people and discussing the matter with her husband, her mother-in-law, and her brother-in-law, she decides to go to Ireland for her mother's 80th birthday. She has not been in Ireland for 25 years. Her mother is 80, or is going to be 80 in August as well, as this baby. And so she finds herself on the way back to Ireland. In Ireland is Jim Farrell. Jim Farrell is the guy who owned the pub that she abandoned, as it were, unceremoniously by leaving him a note to say she'd gone back to Brooklyn. He was hoping to marry her. He's still not married. He's in his mid-40s too. He runs the pub. He's a much respected figure. He's a very decent, solid person. And she when she comes, her mother has never mentioned him in any letter to her. Her friend Nancy has not either. So when she comes home, she finds out that he's still not married. But Nancy, her friend, tells her he's doing a strong line in Dublin, with a woman in Dublin. Now, this is again idiom and Irish usage and American usage. I nearly put a footnote or an asterisk to say, look, a strong line in Ireland means a romance. It does not mean what it used to mean in America, which I think used to mean that some sort of drug you would take. A strong line. He took a strong line. But anyway, so that's all she hears about Jim, that he's alive, that he's still not married, he's still running the pub, but he's doing a strong line. But Nancy has just made that up. It's not true. So anyway, she's having great difficulty with her mother because her mother has not done anything to the kitchen in 25 years. So it's still there. There's no fridge. There's no, everything is old. She decides to buy these things for her mother without consulting her. And obviously a row ensues because her mother says, I've been waiting all the years for you to come home to buy me a fridge. Is that what I've been doing? And her mother says, at that time in Ireland, people were very worried about electricity bills. They thought they were too high. And her mother says, I'll be paying the electricity bill while you're sunning yourself in America. Anyway, so that's the sort of thing going on. And Eilish eventually has to one evening, she just decides that she'll just go for a walk. It's dark. This is the month of, this is the beginning of June, say. And it's about 10 o'clock in the evening. It's 1976. And she goes out for a walk on her own in the town. As she wondered about how she might set about persuading her mother to come for a drive with her someday, she saw a figure standing at the door of Jim Farrell's pub. Instantly, she realized that it was Jim himself. She did not know if he had seen her. Now, they haven't seen one another for 25 years. He was looking in the other direction, but he might have averted his gaze precisely because he had spotted her coming towards him on the opposite footpath. Even though she put her head down, she was sure he would not be able to avoid noticing her. There was no one else on the street. If she were to turn her head and glance across, their eyes would connect. She would not know what to do, and she could not imagine how he might respond. Maybe he had not actually recognized her, but if he had seen her, they could hardly just nod to each other or say a polite hello. The best thing would be for her not to look across at him again and to proceed to the square without glancing behind. An encounter like this was always bound to happen. She'd never imagined, however, that if she were to see him, she would actually feel an urge, as she did now, to approach him, speak to him, hear his voice. But it could not be done. She would have to continue on her walk through the town as if he were not standing watching her from the door of his pub. Now, if this were one of those books mentioned by William Maxwell or those people, you could end there. You could end the novel there. That she'd come home from America. She'd seen her mother. They hadn't got on. And then she saw the man who she was in love with, just for 1 second, and never again. And you could end the story there. The problem is, because of that first 3 pages, you can't do that now. You've set up a sort of an engine that no matter what you do has to roar. And so you have to have them meet again. And because he runs a pub, of course, he can see everybody. And Eilish's brother, who's a tremendous talker, he comes into the pub and says, my sister's had another fight with my mother, and she's gone down on her own to stay in a little house that the brother owns on the cliff in County Wexford, about 10 miles away on the coast. And Jim listens to this, and he's the least impulsive of people, but he decides, actually, the only way I can get to talk to her is if I drive down and try and find her down there now, since she's on her own down there. And so he sees her car, so he realizes that she is down there. She sees her car on the lane that leads to the cliff. He realizes where the house is. He goes to the house, but she's not there. And he thinks he'll just go down the cliff to the beach. When he saw her walking towards him on the strand, he realized that she would be alarmed at the sight of him no matter what. He was an intruder on her solitude. But she had seen him. He could not turn. She was wearing a blue dress and had a towel under her arm. As he was trying to work out what to say, a wave came rushing in towards him, and he had to dart quickly away from it. He felt for a moment a sense of pure disbelief that this was happening. He looked down at the sand, and when he lifted his head, she was there. The expression on her face, not angry or fearful, but puzzled, almost amused. How did you know I was here? Your brother, Martin, was in the bar. He told me. And you drove down. I saw you on the street a while ago, and I worried we might never get a chance. How are you? She asked. Good. I'm glad to see you. Will you walk back with me? She asked. If anyone were to meet them now, he thought they might be a local couple taking a walk. But when he stole a glance at her, he saw this could not be true. She did not look like a local woman. Her dress could not have been bought in Ireland, and the natural way her hair was cut set her apart, as did the smoothness of her skin. But more than anything, it was the ease and confidence she had. Her face was thinner. He could see some wrinkles at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes were bright and alert, and her gaze was focused as she turned to him and spoke decisively. I'm told you're doing a strong line with a woman in Dublin. Who told you that? Everyone knows it, except me. Is that why you're blushing? He could think of nothing to say in reply. He wasn't sure if she had really heard such a thing, or if she'd made it up in order to break the silence. And you? He asked. I'm a married woman and a mother. How long are you staying? 4 or 5 weeks more. My children are coming at the beginning of August. He noticed that she did not say her husband was coming too, and was glad. He would not relish seeing Eilish with her American husband in the streets of the town. He noticed, how is your mother? Well, she's well. He wanted to ask her the reason she was here alone, but every question he thought of seemed wrong. It occurred to him that he really wanted to ask if she had thought about him much over the years, and if she had ever regretted not staying with him. Do you like it down here? He asked. It's so calm, empty, she said. When they came to the steps that led to the cliff, she found her sandals. He helped her climb the loose sand to the first step. As he took her hand, he thought that this might have been what he came down here for, to touch her once, to have her smile as she leaned on him, and then to walk slowly behind her up to the edge of the cliff. In the lane, he saw what she was doing. She was somehow making this encounter natural, uncomplicated. He would get no chance to ask her anything. As the early evening sunlight caught her face, her smile was a mask. But there was no strain in her voice. Your accent hasn't changed much, she said. Sometimes I try to sound more American, but the kids say I just sound even more Irish. Have they been to Ireland before? Never. Nor you, since you left. This is my first time since then. Neither of them, he knew, would have any trouble remembering what then meant. He wished he had been with her all the years, but there was nothing that could be done about that now. For a second he also wished, but he did not. It struck him that since this was probably the last time he would see her, he should say something. But then he thought it would be best to leave it. There was nothing to say, or nothing that was easy or simple, nothing that he could find words for now. You look so sad, she said. I feel sad seeing you. Don't be sad about that. It was the way it had to be. And do you ever? I don't know, he said. Do you ever think about me? As soon as he had said it, he knew how wrong it sounded. It was as if he was looking for pity or needing her to say something comforting to him. He watched her thinking. She had decided, he saw, not to respond. When he had known her, she was softer. She would have made it easier for him. Now, as they stood by her car, it was clear she wanted him to go. She put out her hand. That was as much as she would do. She did not want to embrace him. He would say nothing more to embarrass her or himself. I hope I didn't surprise you too much. Not at all, she said. I thought we should see each other. It would be hard to do that in the town. When she did not answer, he reached out and shook her hand. He walked up the lane to his car. He stood and inspected the horizon before taking out his keys and opening the car and turning it so that he could go back to Enniscorthy. Thank you. I think there's a microphone And if anyone has any questions or comments, or indeed if anyone knows anything more about literature than I do, it would be great to hear from you. We have the mic here. Is there somebody over there?
Thank you. You said you had not planned to come back to Ailish. Why did you return to this character?
Right. I mean, there's something awfully cheap about sequels. You know that if you think about the novels of the 19th century, that if we'd had a sequel to Pride and Prejudice, it would have ruined the whole thing because Mr. Darcy would have turned out to be a bully or a gambler or a drunk or just boring, and it could have all just gone downhill. So the whole purpose of the book was to build it up to a certain point and then leave it. And I was thinking about Ulysses by James Joyce, which, as you know, happens in one day. Oh my God, imagine a sequel. They woke up the following morning and decided to go again, like another 800 pages based on the Iliad this time. And then the third one I thought of was, imagine if Moby Dick had a brother, and it's just, these things are just unthinkable, And so the whole point of a novel is that you bring it up and you bring it down. In other words, that you slowly realize, in the same way as land comes to an end, moving towards sea, that you start bringing the thing down. And you leave it a great deal to the reader's imagination at the end. But there's an aftermath somehow in every novel that isn't expressed or explained, and therefore it has to be respected. And so it just never occurred to me. I mean, in other words, I would never have done it. And I think it was about 12. I had one image only, which was that her brother, Ailish's brother, walks along that beach with two children, who are Ailish's two children, who really look extraordinary because they're clearly mixed with, they look like Italians. And a man stops them and says to the brother, who are these two? And says, oh, they're Ailish's kids, they're home to see their granny. And the man, just an ordinary person from Irish from Enniscorthy, just says, look at it, because it was just a new thing, a piece of news. But that was all I had. And that's not in the book. It was in the book, but it just didn't work in the book. And so, but then that opening came into my head, and I thought, you can't do that. I mean, in other words, it's the very opposite of the sort of opening that I like. In other words, I like an opening that builds slowly, that comes from an angle, you don't quite know what's going to happen, and that you're introduced very slowly to things. And it may be, in fact, a way of deflecting attention and opening, where the real opening is coming in a while. But I thought of this and thought, it's about time I stopped all this lyrical stuff and all this slow stuff. My mother she was very polite, my mother, and she was still alive when I published a lot of the books, and she didn't know what to say about them, so she used to love saying, I really love Saul Bellow. He's so smart. The novels are so fast-moving, and there's so many smart people. And I realized that I think it was a way of saying, why don't you try that? But obviously, I couldn't try Saul Bellow. But I did, think that maybe I should just for once try that and see. And then I found that theory of the plot in Edward Mendelssohn. But so I just did. And I was also tentative, and I actually blamed the pandemic for everything. It was just those long days with the fact that when you realize that whatever it was called, the germs were airborne. So just every breath I take, oh, here it comes, and it's there, it's here. And therefore you have days where you just relax and, you can go nowhere. And so I wrote the first section of it during the pandemic and then left it for a good while. But I'm not proud. I'm not recommending other people write sequels, and I'm slightly ashamed. But here we go. Yes, we have someone just there.
I was just curious as to what your inspiration was for the character Ailish. Is this based on somebody you knew, or just a figment of your imagination, or how did she come about?
How she came about? Henry James said that he loved when someone told him half a story, and that if you told him a whole story, it would be no use to him because he wouldn't be able to imagine he just needed an anchor, not an anchor, but he needed a base, a sort of fertile land in which to sow things. And so my father died in the summer of 1967 when I was 12, and people came to the house. It was a small town. People came to the house every evening. And it sort of dwindled, so a lot would come, and then as it grew into September, October, November, fewer. But every evening, someone would call. My job was to answer the door, deal with coats and hats and all that, and then bring the person, whoever it was, into the back room where my mother was. And they would say something very consoling at the beginning, and then they would never mention it again, because the whole point of the evening was sort of to distract. And so the woman in question who came that October, November in 1967, I can remember what she was wearing. I knew who she was. She'd never been in the house before, but I knew her and where her house was. And she had a handbag with her, and she kept taking out things and then eventually letters. And those letters were from Brooklyn, not Manhattan, not New York, Brooklyn. Brooklyn, her daughter in Brooklyn. And when that woman left that evening, or some other time, someone said, that woman's daughter who came back from Brooklyn that time, she'd actually got married before she came home, because the fellow was so crazy about her that he just was worried she would never come back. So they married. But then when she came back to Ireland, she realized that it was too sad to be able to tell her family, that she'd married in America, and therefore she would be going back very soon. And therefore she didn't tell them, and then she did. Now that's all I had. I mean, in other words, and that, so when I was writing a novel called Nora Webster, which is really about the atmosphere, and it's I suppose the most autobiographical book I've written, but it's about my mother in those 3 years after my father died. And I just needed something about the flavor of what people would talk about. And I didn't want it to be high gossip or anything particularly interesting. So I just needed about 4 sentences where this woman came and talked about Brooklyn and her daughter and etc. And I then went to Texas to teach at the university in Austin for a semester. And in the mornings in that year, I grew homesick, which I'd never had before, really. And here I was, a grown man, lying in bed, wanting things that I didn't even like. In other words, missing Irish news, which I don't like, Irish food, all those, but essentially something in the atmosphere that I wanted. But I couldn't put a name on it, but I knew in the mornings I wanted to go home. And home, And so eventually the semester was up, I went home, and I decided to go back to work for a change, and I read the opening chapter of Nora Webster, which was all I'd written of the book. I found those 4 sentences. Just reading, I thought, wow, that's a story. That has a shape, the going, the coming back. And so I started to work. I didn't know whether it would be a long story or a novel, but really that's how I worked. And I don't think I could have done it had I not had the experience of myself in Texas. Obviously I was very privileged, there was nothing to moan about, but that never stops anyone. And so that's really how the character grew. Yeah. But it's also that my mother had a younger sister who didn't go to America. I didn't go to Brooklyn, but she was exactly the same age, and she was, in almost the same circumstances. So I'm sort of using things that you imagine, adding them to things you've experienced, and adding them to some real story or bit of a story that you've heard. So that's how it started.
Thank you. Just wanted to know how you picked Lindenhurst as the town. I grew up on Long Island, so I know it very well. It's a good choice, by the way.
Oh, I started to go out there on my own, on the train, and then drive out. If anyone was around with a car, you could just go out and just keep going around. What I was looking for was a place which had 4 ordinary houses that could be together with the same garden in a cul-de-sac. And then one day theirs was. I found the cul-de-sac. And also I needed then to start working out how near it was to near it was to water, and what the light was like. And so I did all that. And I must have looked at, there are a lot of beautiful old photographs, in books of the old, what the thing was like before and all that. So so that's really, it was just going from place to place, just looking and looking. I didn't ask anyone because there's so many versions even, but I still can't. If you could help me, I'd really like you to, if you could just help me to say Long Island. Yeah. I'm really working on it. There's somebody...
What was the biggest or the hardest or the most surprising thing about how it changed in the revision process?
Oh, how the book changed in the revision process. there's a really big difference in writing a novel which has a plot, meaning action and its consequences, because anything that isn't part of that has to go. And you can try and add things about characters or something that amuse you, or Larry could have a big story in from school, or a lot of stuff early in the book about Ailish has a job and she's working in a garage. I mean, she's in charge of something very important, which anyone who's ever dealt with that person knows. If you go to a garage with a car and it needs a spare part, you need to know how quickly can you get me that part. And there's often a person who has to sort of stall you and say, well, why don't you come back, or I'll call you. You say, no, can you find out for me now? Because I need to know, will I have a car tomorrow or the next day? And that person's job is then to cajole various depots to say, do you have this particular thing? And if so, can I have it now? And so that's her job. But I had a lot of detail about exactly how she went about this. And that had to go, because it needed to move much closer to the story itself. And so the story itself became the sort of, I suppose, the engine or the mechanism. And anything that wasn't part of that had to be cut back. Not too much, but there were times when I think I did leave it in the end. It's that Larry, who's her kid, who's all American, he comes into Ireland and immediately he gets involved with everything that's going on in the town, including he has to go to Gaelic football matches where you can touch the ball, you can lift the ball and touch it, unlike soccer. And he goes to rugby matches. And of course, he comes in one day and gives a big account of what he's just seen, a big row going on between players. And I thought, do I need this? And then I thought, without it, you're starting to just make bare bones of plot. You've got to sort of be careful. But really what it was I delivered the book in January of last year. And so it's just published now. And so I had about a year to just read it myself. Since you want other people to read your book, maybe you should read it. And, and in the reading of it each time, I would find things, but always things to cut. So that's really what the revision was like. Is there somebody else?
Jessie Buckley did the audio for your book. Have you listened to her, and do you listen to the audio of your books?
I've worked with a few amazing people on that, and not that I've worked with them. The last thing they want near is the author. But Meryl Streep did The Testament of Mary, which was an amazing idea, and I think she had a sort of cold, so that her voice is deep. But what happens is after about 5 minutes, you become completely engaged by her. You actually see an actress at work, where she's somehow building up, just on audio, a sort of person is coming across. The same thing happened with Fiona Shaw, who did Nora Webster. And then I did one, but it's only a book of essays, because you can read your own essays, but you can't probably read your own novel, because you'll underplay something. You just get it wrong. So it was just great when Jessie Buckley said she'd do it. And there's a problem, because some of the accents are American, and you've got to work out how to do that. I wouldn't have a clue. I wouldn't even start. So I thought she did that really well, and then she gets Ailish very well. So yeah, it was just great. People are busy, actresses, and you've really it's awful work if you're doing an audio, because if your stomach rumbles, and really I've seen this happen where if your stomach makes the smallest sound, the mic picks it up, and the director said, "Are you having a problem with your stomach?" No. Well, come in and listen, because there's something going on in there, and it means also if you fluff anything, you have to do it again. But then the producer comes back in to say, could you try that again? There's something. So it's very slow work. It's not just, you don't just read the book. It takes hours and hours. And so I thought she did a good job. You can't really listen to all of it if you wrote it, because you want to be mad, start listening to your own books. Do you know what I mean? There's something wrong about that. I won't say what it is. Just that I think that Narcissus ended badly, didn't he? Yeah. Somebody there? Over there? Yeah.
I read Brooklyn and saw the movie, enjoyed it a lot, both of them. So I'm happy that you did write a sequel. But I don't remember the character Mark. I don't remember Ailish having a brother. Is that new to this novel?
That's a really great question, because it's in the novel, but it's not in the movie. And in other words, in the novel, and you can see why this happens, because when she's to go to America, in the novel, she goes to Liverpool first, which was often what people did, and got the ship from Liverpool. But while she's in Liverpool, she sees her 3 brothers who are working in the Birmingham, Liverpool area. And when her mother dies, it's the 3 brothers who come home, and one of them writes to her a sort of letter saying, you have to come home but Nick Hornby, when he was writing the screenplay, realized that you have to get her to Brooklyn soon. And it's almost like that plot thing I was talking about. You have to draw a line. The line cannot be jagged if you're trying to, in a film called Brooklyn. You have to get her to Brooklyn soon. You've got about 15 minutes. And if she's not in Brooklyn by then, really. And so there's really no need for her to go to Liverpool. And so it's not in the movie. And that's yeah. Yes, please. Why don't we, yeah, and we'll go there then. Is that okay?
I've read several of your books, and I don't know which ones you consider not having a plot of your own books.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that Nora Webster really doesn't have a plot in that there's no moment where you say, what is she going to do? Like a choice has come her way, something has occurred, and now we have to work out what the consequences of that will be. It seems to be a much more, it depends on sort of rhythm, depends on just trying to keep drama going in a very, I think, shaded or shadowy way. But there is nothing, there's no big moment in the book. So I think that would be an example of one. Yeah.
Your Irish stories are just really lovely. But how about The Magician and The Master? They're quite different.
Yeah.
And what motivates you to write those? I mean, they must be very satisfying because they're really very satisfying reads. And are you thinking of another writer that you might write about?
I don't have a third in my head, but I didn't have a sequel either in my head. But I don't immediately. I mean, one of the things that happened was that I wrote a novel called The Blackwater Lightship. And it happens in Ireland over 7 days with 6 characters. So it's a house. And in there is a family. And the levels of recrimination and the making of tea and the blaming one another for everything that has happened in the past. The rain is outside. And it really goes on like that for 250 pages. And I mean, I had to write that. And, it was so upsetting in the end, just the whole business of how much that time didn't seem to solve anything for anyone, that I thought, I'll never do that again. I don't want any more Irish people. I don't want any more rain. I don't want any more recrimination. Any more making tea, saying rosaries, Catholic people. I don't want any of it at all. I want no more. And then I was going to write a sort of a small book of essays on Henry James because I'd been, thinking about him. I'd been writing about him. And then it occurred to me one day when I did a radio talk on him that I was talking about him as though he were a character in a novel. Just that thought. It's as simple as that. And I began to work on that book, which is called The Master. And it was very satisfying because I got to go to Rome and Venice and, I got to imagine duchesses. It was so glamorous and it was so far away from home. And then, of course, it got closer and closer to home in other ways. But and it was almost the same with The Magician, where it came after Nora Webster. And so that, in other words, I'm being a bit sort of flippant about the Irish stuff, but I mean, I find it upsetting, but upsetting is not the word either. I mean, I find that you end up pulling a lot of raw emotion onto the page, that some of it is yours, and some of it is unresolved experience, and you're trying to give a shape to it. And when it's over, you just think, I want to crawl into a hole in the ground after writing this book, because I have, used so much, I suppose, material that's personal and that's raw and that's unresolved. And so that the relief of going off to Venice and thinking, I'm going to write a book set in a palace. I'm from a small house in a small town, and so the writing about James just lifted me. And it was a lot of work, but it was, as you say, it was nice. Yeah, it was good. Yeah. Do we have time for one more? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. What do you do when you have writer's block?
I had a bank manager.
I always ask all the writers.
I had a bank manager who asked me that. I had a bank manager who said that, and I was looking for a loan, and he said, well, what about writer's block? I said, what about bank manager's block? And he said, well, if I have bank manager's block, I'll still be able to do the most. But really, he said, what would you do? And I said, there's no such thing as writer's block. I mean, there's laziness maybe, but I've never had it. I mean, I think that there are times when you're writing something and you have to realize this is rubbish and stop writing it. But it's a hard decision to make, but sometimes it comes to you naturally. You just think, this is awful. But in general, that doesn't happen with me. I mean, I sort of know what I'm doing before I start, and the job then is to do it. And I get wheeled around sometimes to, with people who are studying writing, to say, like, what advice can you give? As though somehow you could say, well, I think if you use more semicolons, your work will thrive, But actually, there's just one thing and one thing only. And it's so practical and it's so true that it really, I don't think it helps anyone. I don't think it helps any students at all when they hear it, that you have to control your weekend. That if you're not controlling your Friday night and your Saturday night, if you're hungover on a Saturday, and if you're hungover on a Sunday, then like that, there's just no future, because there's a lot of future for you socially, and you have a lot of friends, but you need to control those 2 nights of the week, at least for some months of the year, in order to get a novel written. Because if you don't have Saturday and Sunday, you really begin. I think writer's block is where you face into Monday with a mild vodka tequila hangover, and it just isn't possible. And I mean, illegal drugs would be much worse, because they give you all sorts of mental things. But in other words, no drugs, no drink for at least 1 week of every month for a year. And then, but I think that you could so easily get into the habit of going around Dublin saying, I'm blocked. And everybody would look, and everybody would say, oh, and feel sorry for you. But I have a feeling that there's something you could always do about that, But there are a few people, I mean, there's a great American writer, Ralph Ellison, who just wrote Invisible Man. It's such a good book. But so you can't really call him, he was a genius. Maybe we end with that. Ralph Ellison, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to put you behind the desk. And if any of you would like to stay and get your book signed, Tara is right here. And if you'll just follow Tara around, she'll show you how the line is going to go. Thank you again for coming. Colm Tóibín, we love you. Thank you.